As we prepare for the exam that's coming up, I wanted to take a minute to just walk you through the flowchart for parsing verbs. We've talked about this in various ways in class, but I wanted to take a minute to walk you all the way through it as best I can, and then do a couple of examples. So let's get started. So the parsing flowchart, first step. First question you always want to ask is, does it have an augment or reduplication? You should, at this point, I think, know what those two things are. So we'll go to the first part where it has an augment. Okay, so the augment section that we see here can then lead to the next question: does it have a tense formative? Okay, so we answer yes to the question of augment. Then we get to the question of tense formative, and then the first section that we would have in this is yes. So what if we have an augment and then we have a tense formative? Then that leads to some further questions. So if it's sigma alpha, if the tense formative is sigma alpha, then we have a first aorist active or first aorist middle. If we say yes and the tense formative is an alpha, then we have a liquid aorist active. And this goes right along, by the way, with the master verb chart that you have at the end of chapter 25. So from there, if you don't have a sigma alpha, which tells you it's aorist active, or if you don't have an alpha that tells you it's a liquid aorist active, and to be perfectly honest on the exam, I don't care if you have a liquid aorist, first aorist, second aorist. I just want you to get it right that it's an aorist. If you have a theta eta, the theta eta is going to tell you that you have an aorist passive. Along with that, you also have an eta option, which would tell you it's a second aorist passive. Okay, so that gives you all of the options for augment and a tense formative. Sigma alpha, alpha, aorist active, or middle, although you don't have a liquid aorist middle at least listed in your master verb chart. Then we have theta eta is a first aorist passive, eta is a second aorist passive. So what if the answer to your question about the tense formative is no? Well, if the answer to that is no, then that leads to another question: is there a stem spelling change? Is there a spelling change from the lexical form, which is built off the present tense stem, to the stem that you're facing, which would be either an augment, would be either one where there is a spelling change, one where there isn't a spelling change, and we'll get to see what the result of that is in just a second. So if there is a spelling change to the stem from the present tense stem that you have in your lexical form to the stem that you have in the form that's in front of you, then you have a second aorist active or middle. Okay. If there is no tense formative, or if there is no spelling change of the stem after not having a tense formative, then you have an imperfect active or middle passive, depending upon your endings. Okay, and just remember, I didn't say this a moment ago, if you have a first aorist or second aorist passive, you're going to have secondary active endings. So this walks us through all of the augmented tenses in the indicative: sigma alpha, alpha, theta eta, eta. All of these are aorist tense formatives. The only thing that's different is that the ones at the top here, sigma alpha and alpha, are for aorist actives, both first aorist active or middle, liquid aorist active, which is there below it, and then over here we have the second aorist active or middle when there is a spelling change of the stem. Then with the theta eta and the eta, we have the first aorist passive and the second aorist passive. If there is an augment, no tense formative, and no spelling change, it's an imperfect active or middle passive, depending upon the ending. So our next option is that there is reduplication. Now, automatically, when there is reduplication, we know that we're dealing with a perfect verb. Now, there are some times, however, when you have reduplication that you're not going to have you're not going to have a consonant followed by an epsilon. You're going to have what we talked about earlier as vocalic reduplication. So vocalic reduplication and augment look the same, pretty much without fail. So the thing that you have to rely upon at this juncture is what's the tense formative. So let's look at that for a moment. So you have reduplication, either vocalic or regular with a consonant. And so the next question is does it have a tense formative? Yes, and it's kappa alpha. There could be an occasion where you might see an alpha as well in a second perfect, but I don't know that you would face that problem very often, and probably not in a way that would ever confuse you with a liquid aorist situation, because the endings would be different or something like that. Because remember, the perfect has primary active and middle passive endings, as opposed to the aorist and the imperfect, which have secondary active and middle passive endings. All right, so you've got the yes, the kappa alpha, maybe on occasion an alpha, but not in a circumstance where it would be terribly confusing to know the difference between an aorist and a perfect, a liquid aorist and a perfect. So you've got yes to that, and then from there you know that you've got a perfect active, because the perfect active is going to have a tense formative of some sort. That doesn't mean that there won't be at times a spelling change in the stem, but that's not going to be primary for your identification of whether or not it's a perfect verb. You could have a spelling change in the stem, still have reduplication, still have the kappa alpha, and it would still be just figured as a regular first perfect verb. So you've got reduplication, and it doesn't have a tense formative. So the answer to that is no. And then you're going to have a perfect middle passive. Okay. Now, the other thing just to keep in mind, particularly with vocalic reduplication circumstances, is that even if you have vocalic reduplication and then these passive endings, you're not going to confuse it with an aorist passive, because aorist passive use active endings and tense formative. So you'll have theta, eta, or eta, or if it's a second aorist middle, you're going to have a spelling change of the stem, and you're going to have a connecting vowel. The same would be said for an imperfect. You're going to have a connecting vowel. Here, you have no tense formative. You have no connecting vowel. You've got reduplication. You've got the perfect tense stem, and you've got the middle passive endings, the primary middle passive endings. So our last section here is neither. It doesn't have an augment. It doesn't have reduplication. So if we have a circumstance like that, where we don't have an augment, we don't have reduplication, we have neither, then there are two options left. So the next question we have to ask is, does it have a tense formative? If the answer to that is yes, then we have to ask the further question of what is the tense formative. If it's sigma or epsilon sigma, then we have a future active or middle. If it's theta eta sigma or eta sigma, we have a future passive. And to differentiate this, again, from what you have in the first aorist passive and the second aorist passive, you're not going to have secondary endings. You're going to have primary endings, because there is no augment. Okay? So theta eta sigma or eta sigma, and these tense formatives will have connecting vowels. Remember, when the tense formative ends in a vowel, there's no connecting vowel. When there is a consonant at the end of the tense formative, then you will have the connecting vowel. So epsilon sigma for the first aorist, or for the future active or future middle, sigma, epsilon sigma, theta eta sigma for the future passive. The last section we have is for neither. There is no augment, no reduplication, and there is no tense formative. So that is going to lead you to a present active or present middle passive. Okay, and the way that you would differentiate between those is to look at the endings. Is it o a se amaneta usen, or o mai a itai amata esta ontai? Okay. Now we're going to look at a couple of examples. I think three examples that we have here. So the first one is akaluthon. So let's look at this for a second. I'm going to draw on this a little bit. So the first question is, do we have an augment? And the answer to that is yes, we have an augment. It's this eta here. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, and the first question, even before this augment or duplication, which is something that you're identifying from the word, is determining what is its lexical form. And the lexical form for this is a, ka. My writing with this is less than stellar. Should have chosen a shorter word here. Akalu. The O. So it's a contract verb. Please forgive the poor handwriting. Probably not going to do that again. I'm just going to say it and expect you to figure out what it is. So this alpha lengthens to an eta. Now, there could be a question of, is this one that has vocalic or duplication? And we'll answer pretty quickly why we don't think it is one like that. So, akalutha o. So notice where the stem ends is here. So I want to make sure I spelled that correctly. I did not spell it correctly in the handout or in the scene here. That should end in an omicron upsilon. Oops. So anyway, we'll leave it as it is and finish out. So what happens here, this should have an upsilon right there in between the omicron and the nu. I should have looked at this more carefully when I was typing it out. From there, the stem ends at the theta. So we ask ourselves, when we look here at the omicron nu ending, is this next question. So we've got augment, which we've come up here. We ask the tense formative question. So the stem ends in theta, which could be just a little deceptive, because you might expect theta tells us got to be an aorist passive because theta eta, but the answer is, well, no, it's not the case here. So then we ask ourselves, we got the theta, and then we've got this un ending. And so we ask ourselves, does it have a tense formative? Does it have a sigma alpha, theta, eta, or eta? And the answer is no. So we're going to go here. And so from there, we ask ourselves, does this have a spelling change in the stem? Now, that spelling change in the stem is something beyond what happens if there's an addition of an augment. So there's a spelling change here for sure, but it's only as a result of the augment. So there's not really a spelling change. So you've got alpha, kappa, omicron, lambda, omicron, upsilon, theta. All of that's the same. So there's not a spelling change in the stem. So we go here from no to spelling change in the stem. The answer to that is no, which brings us over here, which gets us to imperfect active or middle passive. So we've got an imperfect active or middle passive. Then we look at the ending, omicron, upsilon, nu. So you've got an omicron plus an epsilon. So the ending is on. Excuse me. So that on ending is a secondary active ending, and if, as you recall, that's the same in both the first singular and the third plural. So without a context, then we would have to say that this is imperfect, active, indicative, and it's either first singular or third plural. Okay. So hopefully my typing was a little better on the next word. So I'm going to erase these markings, and we'll go on to our next word. So our next word is zetethesetai. And so the lexical form of this is from zeteo. And so since we've got zeteo, which I believe means I seek, we look here and we ask ourselves the question, I didn't erase these lines here on our flowchart. Let me erase those as well. And go back to our drawing utensil. So we don't have an augment because there's nothing in front of the zete, and lexical form is zeteo. So we ask ourselves the question, does it have an augment? It does not. Does it have a duplication? It does not. Does it have neither? And the answer is yes. So we're moving our way down this chart here. Okay. So the answer is neither. The second question is, do we have a tense formative? And so we look here and we say zete. It looks like the epsilon of zeteo has lengthened to an eta. And so then we look for a tense formative. And the tense formative is theta, eta, sigma. So theta, eta, sigma. So the answer is yes. So we go over here, and then we go over here. And we know the answer has got to be future passive. It's future passive indicative. That's all you know. And so then we have to look at our ending, etai, and what is its person and number? The person and number is third person singular. So what we have here is a future passive indicative, third person singular from zeteo, and it means he, she, it will be sought or looked for or something like that. Okay? All right, so that leaves us with one more. Let me erase this again, and we'll move these out. Okay, and this marking here and here and here. We'll switch to this, and then we'll do one more. The last one, elabon. So the key element of this one is to figure out what the lexical form is, and the only way you're going to be able to figure out the lexical form on this one is to memorize it. And the lexical form for elabon is lambano. Okay? So once we get there, we can recognize, if we know the lexical form is lambano, we ask ourselves this augment reduplication question, we'll be moving up here to augment, then we'll go over here, does it have a tense formative? The answer is there is no sigma alpha. There is no alpha because we don't see the alpha there. There is no theta, eta, or eta for that matter. So we do have an augment. We don't have a tense formative, so we'll go in this section of the flowchart, and then we'll ask ourselves, is there a spelling change in the stem? And so if we look at lambano and we look at elabon, the answer to that spelling change question is yes. Okay, so we get to the yes, and that tells us that we have a second aorist active or middle. So we have second aorist active or middle. We'll look then at the ending. This ending here is on. So let's go through again through our chart. On, s, in, amen, eta, on. Well, that's got to be in the active column. So it's a second aorist active. If you just put aorist on the test, that'll be outstanding. An aorist active indicative, because remember that's all you know. An aorist active indicative, first person singular, third person plural. And the fact of the matter is you'll probably see third plural more than first singular, but you gotta give both options if it's on a parsing that is outside of a particular context. Now the benefit you will have on the test is that all of your parsings will come from a particular passage that you will have at least some small amount of context with as you do the work. So I hope walking through this flowchart has been helpful. I'm going to post both this video and the flowchart proper on Blackboard, and I hope that it's helpful to you as you prepare for the test. God bless.